Assalamu alaikum and welcome. Shukran again for joining us.
Wa alaikum salam, Khadija. And I just want to greet your listeners. Assalamu alaikum, Molweni, Sawubona, Dumelang. It's really nice to be back.
It's been a captivating series thus far. We want to remind our listeners that we are going into part 4, of course, as we've been delving into male mental health with yourself. And just a reminder to our listeners that the previous parts are available on our YouTube channel. For those of our listeners who are not aware, Dr. Shaida Jansen has spent years listening deeply to human experience. She is a clinical psychologist, an educator, and a thought leader whose reflections on the inner world of individuals, families, and communities have helped us to reframe pain as an invitation to deeper understanding. Today, we are delving into a statement that men are emotionally competent, and of course drawing from your research in a group therapy that you've done with men. We want to start off the conversation, Dr. Shaida, with asking the question, when we speak about emotionally competent, what do we mean when we speak about emotions and feelings?
Yeah, I think that's a very important question perhaps to start with, because we bandy about this notion of emotion. We talk about emotional intelligence. We say that person is very emotionally expressive. Or then we say, and what is often said quite a lot, is we say, oh, men do not do feelings. Men do not express emotions. And of course, men themselves parrot this notion. They repeat it themselves. And they often say that they don't do emotions. And so I think for me that is something to be interrogated. Because as usual, we start off by first reminding ourselves that we're dealing with people. And so we're talking about what does it mean to be human. And when we look at the dimensions of being human, we understand that at our essence, we are spiritual, we are connected at our essence. And then that social spirituality then is expressed in many dimensions. One of it, which is the body, you like to talk about the spiritualized
flesh.
Body, right? Spiritualized flesh. Or if we say it in biblical terms, the body is a temple. It's not just flesh, right? And the term for flesh in Xhosa is umzimba, right? So the body is not just flesh, it is spiritualized flesh. But today what we're looking at is another equally important component of being human, and that is inhliziyo, the heart or emotions, right? And so when you are then saying that somebody does not engage with feelings, you are in fact suggesting that a whole component, a whole dimension of them being human is absent. So I think this is something that we then need to interrogate and to ask ourselves, what do we mean by men do not express feelings? So if we then go into some of the definitions that the science give us about what emotions are, the science will say that emotions is something that is multidimensional, it is multi-component. So emotions are complex, all right? And emotions also is often divided into two components in terms of there's one dimension of our feelings, which is about emotional experience, and that is feeling the feelings, the arousal level. Like you can feel when you're angry, there's an arousal, right? That you feel. That is feeling the feeling, that's experiencing the emotion. And then we also talk about emotional expression. So we can feel the feeling, but not necessarily express the feeling. What the science seems to be clear on is that both women and men experience emotions. So men experience emotions.
Isn't it what makes you human?
Absolutely, but where there's a difference, and this they have measured when they do the experiments, where men and women differ is in the emotional expressiveness. Right? So in other words, men feel sadness, they feel loss, they feel a sense of panic, just like a woman might feel a sense of loss and a sense of panic when her relationship breaks up, when she loses somebody, or if they lose a child or something in response to loss across the world, because emotions is also one of the things that all humans have in common. And that's why we must be careful when we say that men do not express feelings. We need to be mindful that men experience feelings. Maybe what we are meaning is that they may not be as expressive maybe as women are in terms of saying or expressing how they're feeling. Now, this is where another aspect that we need to understand about emotions. Just like you like to say, it is spiritualized flesh, right? So the body is not just muscle. It's not just biology. The body is imbued with a spirituality. Now, in the same way, our feelings are not just psychological. Mm-hmm. Our feelings are spiritualized emotions, right? And so, hence, you will see that the way we express ourselves emotionally may differ from culture to culture. So what I notice in terms of, for example, mainstream psychology, I can see how mainstream psychology is very much positioned within a more modern Western understanding of emotional expression. So you will find that there's often a discomfort with a kind of expressiveness that may be prevalent, especially in some relational cultures among Global South. If I look at, for example, how some cultures express grief, you will see the open and quite almost explosive and collective expression of grief. You find that in some cultures, women wear certain clothing or colors when the husband has passed on. There's certain rituals that they... So in other words, the way we express emotions, like grief, is very much culturally coordinated. In the same way, masculinity and manhood is a type of culture. And every society will then bring rules for men about what kind of emotions they're able to express publicly and what emotions is best not to express publicly. And remember, men are socialized to follow societal scripts because men ultimately want to be accepted by the society of which they're part of. Men are humans, so they want to belong, all right? So they will adapt their emotional expression in accordance to the societal demands that are made of them. So one of the things, for example, that is less well known is how often women police the expression of male emotions and how men may be punished even by their female partners when they want to start to express more tender or more sensitive feelings. And so emotions, then let me go back, is multidimensional. It has psychological components. It has a strong socio-cultural, spiritual component. It has survivalist components. So let me talk about another dimension of the expression of emotion that is very misunderstood, even by among the educated. So let's talk about the survivalist dimension of emotions. Anger and rage has a very strong immunity component, survivalist. All people have been infused with the ability, the capacity to experience rage and to experience anger. When there's injustice, for example, and you become enraged about that injustice, or you become angry at that injustice, that is what will be a consistent, and it would be a moral response to a real situation. So sometimes anger and aggression, not aggression, because aggression is when you are violent towards somebody or something. We're talking about now the experience of emotions, right? We're saying the experience of anger and the experience of rage, in some instances, may be a moral emotion, right? And so sometimes when we become embarrassed or we feel a sense of shame, it could also be in relation to cultural dynamics. There's certain things that the culture will shame us for. All right? And so when we do certain things, we experience embarrassment, we experience a sense of shame. And so when we then talk about emotions, we always need to say when and where and who. And so we expect men to go public with emotions, and then we shame them, we punish them, we police them for the expression of certain emotions. And so I think we need to, when it comes to men, then I would say that a society needs to organize itself in such a way that boys and men have spaces. And if you look, for example, at something like Uluwaluko, like we say, going to the bush, the initiation of Xhosa men, the Eastern and the Western Cape. I was in one of the countries, Tanzania, and met, they called them, the Maasai, some of the Maasai men. And they call them men who has to kill lions with their bare hands, because in their manhood initiation, it involves, some interaction with lions in the wild. And so if you go across the continent and even in other parts of the world, you will always find that there was manhood, there was masculine and feminine initiation rites, because the society understood that you need to organize yourself and you must have rituals for the kind of masculinities that you want to see expressed in your society. And so again, what I'm doing here, Khadija, I'm again bringing emotions out of the narrow confines that often, in psychology we get taught that emotions is this deep, internal, purely psychological expressions. No, right? Emotions is both inside and outside of us. Some authors talk about emotional geographies. We know that when you walk into certain places, you may walk into a person's house and it can be a very, very beautiful house, but you may feel a sense of coldness. You may feel a sense of unwelcomeness, right? And so feelings are things as information. It guides us. It gives us a notion. That is where the survivalist dimension of emotions. You get a feeling, you still don't know what's going on, and particularly this is very feminine, right?
Yes.
These women, we get feelings, right? You don't act on those feelings, but you're taking note. I'm feeling this way, all right? And that is why parents need to be trained in emotions, so that parents understand that it is normal when a child cries, or when they're being obstinate, or they're being defiant, or they're being frustrated, and they express their frustration. We need special skills and training in how do we actually understand feelings as a fundamental component. And feelings is on a spectrum. There's a range of feelings: joyful, happy, pleasant, nice, warm, fuzzy type of feelings, to the very other extreme feelings that makes us uncomfortable. Sexual desire, for example, sexual feelings, immediately you will see how uncomfortable people become. And one of the slides that I shared with you is Jacques Panksepp, right? Jacques Panksepp was one of his, passed on now, but he was one of the foremost, they call themselves, affective neuroscientists. And these are the guys who they explore the subcortical areas of the mind where the brain is completely equipped, just like the furniture in your house. The brain is equipped to experience a range of emotion. And so they do some experiments where they start tapping on certain aspects of the brain, then you start to be playful and jy wil net jokes maak. Okay? So play is a fundamental, primal human emotion. So, yes, you may be very religious, it's miskien baie soppang, but if you never smile, if you can never crack a joke, if you take yourself so seriously, it means that there is something the matter.
Yeah.
Because as I showed you on that chart, playfulness is a primal emotion. And that is why, again, the education to parents, not to interfere when children are young. They must play. Allow them to be children, to be carefree, to scream, to run around, to climb trees, to be silly, to crack jokes. It's very important dimension of human experience. To be playful is a primal emotion. If you watch lion cubs or you watch the baby species of animals, you will see what they do the whole day. What are they doing? They are playing. So the same way with children, we need to create space for children to play and to be joyful and happy about their happy feelings.
And
right?
for boys to cry.
And for the boys to cry. Thank you, Khadija.
Because from what you're saying, that's exactly it. It's the idea that through societal scripts, that certain feelings are suppressed, denied, negated, ignored, whatever it may be, but in some way or the other, then it, of course, it manifests in grown-ups and grown-ups. And I found this article of yours so interesting where you speak about it like that, and you say that in your therapeutic work, you've identified some pointers for psychotherapists to work with. And the starting point, number one, and it didn't surprise me when I read this, when number one, the first one is celebrating men as fully human. Yeah. And it goes back to the very start of our series when the question was asked. And so let's go back to the source. We are all human.
Yeah.
Let's go back to the question, what does it mean to be a human being before we go into what does it mean to be a male? And what kind of man do you want to be? But I was so interested now when you spoke about the conditioning and you spoke specifically about men. Are men inclined, in your experience and in your research, to be a bit more, or let's say to succumb more to societal scripts, or to want to conform more to societal scripts?
Absolutely, and I think that is why we don't talk about masculinity. We talk about masculinities, because depending on where the man is, they want to subscribe to whatever that context, that society. They will adapt their masculinity to the demands of the context. And you know where this plays out so nicely is in the men's groups. Before, I used to try to develop, to set up groups separately for young boys, like for teenage boys, 14, 15, 16, right? Until I realized I started to mix the boys, the teenage boys, with adult males. So in one group you may have a 50-something-year-old man, a 40-something, a 30-something-year-old man. So you may have a grandfather in the group, a guy who's a father or an uncle. And then I will put in that same group a 15-year-old, a 14-year-old, okay? What you will find, and I recall this one incident where you will find that the young boys are still so close to their feelings that an older man will say, wow, I'm learning from you about the importance of expressing sadness. I'm admiring you that you are able to go so close to your own feelings. Because remember, in the men's group, we believe that to go close to your feelings is to be human.
Yeah.
Got nothing to do with gender.
Yeah, yeah.
Okay? The shared humanity between genders is that we all human. When we have a loss, we grieve. When we feel joy, we laugh. We express pleasant emotions. And that is what the genders share in common. So the young men then in the men's group often becomes the role models. Because remember, group therapy is a therapy that is founded on role modeling. Because we're not just talking there and analyzing. You see in real time, the man hears and sees and he starts to feel the sadness that this boy is expressing. And so this young man expressing his sadness and being so close to his feelings allow the older men who has now had much more time to suppress, and they've spent so much time suppressing their feelings, and now this young man is actually allowing this older man to reclaim. And once the men begin to practice and get in touch with their feelings again, it's like a muscle. When you use it, then it becomes strong.
And it makes me think about last week's conversation where we focused on loneliness, and you spoke again about the stigmas that's attached to it and how this is so much more impactful for men. We spoke about how there's varying degrees of inadequacies that men feel that's directly related to societal expectations, and how often there's a lot of judgment, and because of that, inadvertently and maybe not even consciously or recognizing it always, they conform to this, and how that then shapes and informs their patterns of behavior and how they engage their spouses and just on various levels in their roles, how they then engage. Now, I say that on the one hand, and on the other hand, I want to bring up another term that's often also sort of become cliched and just touted around when we speak about emotional intelligence. It's often a term that's attached to men as in this lacking, that they are lacking in that regard. What does it mean when we speak about that? And what role do we play then? And I go back to something you mentioned earlier on, and I know it didn't slip past myself or our listeners when you said it, that at times women punish men for reacting and responding or acting in particular ways.
Yeah.
Connect all that for us, please.
You want me to get into more trouble, do you? I think many times, like going back to the societal script. So both men and women subscribed often to common societal scripts about how a girl ought to behave or how a boy needs to behave. And then both genders reinforce and police certain scripts in terms of gendered behavior. And so often for girls, we are supposed to be all pure and demure, right? And a woman, for example, that is very opinionated, like myself, may create a lot of discomfort for some people because it's against the script about how a woman ought to behave.
Docile and submissive.
Absolutely, right? And so, again, in the same way, for a man, if you a man, some men are very close to their feelings, and they expressive emotionally, all right? And they are men, but they are fully human. And so some men, they express grief, and they may even cry, they may even shed tears, right? And that doesn't in any way diminish their manhood. But for some people, and for some women, when that happens, for them alarm bells goes off. They say, oh my God, this man, there's something wrong with him. Why is he expressing so much sadness? Why is he so close to all of these kind of feelings? And often, sometimes, when somebody gets close to their feelings, it obviously triggers the suppressed sadness in yourself. And so even for that reason, And that is also often why we punish children. Children are very expressive with their feelings, and children are close to their feelings, and they often express feelings that makes us as adults very uncomfortable, right? So if a child doesn't like my dress or these colors that I'm wearing, they might say very directly to me, "And Shaida, that's an ugly dress," right? And my response would be, "Thank you. I like the fact that you express your opinion. You are very clear about what you like." But for other adults, that child may get severely punished. And that child may be seen to be disrespectful.
Yes.
Whereas for me, that child was just being honest. I'm wearing purple. She doesn't like purple. Or she doesn't think that I look good in purple. Right? And so I think this kind of policing and actually suppressing of emotions is actually a collective ritual that goes on all the time. So let me go back to how South Africa for me is very much a country that is strongly overlaid with modern Western norms. And so when we say men are not emotionally expressive, I'm thinking in the culture of psychology that I was socialized in, I thought it's very stiff upper lip. It's very like unexpressive. It's stoic. It's for me like you can feel you're not supposed to become too exuberant,
which goes completely against our Africanness.
Absolutely. So then we say men are emotionally unexpressive, and I'm thinking, are we not projecting? Is that not a cultural projection? Right? Where we tend to lay on men, which is actually in the society. So those are also the things, that we need to look at. But I now want to go to the clinical example, Khadija, because I'm always aware how the time flies when we are talking. So we're speaking about emotions, and we've now, laid out a bit how emotions, the complications and the culturedness and the norms and all of that comes to play in terms of the way we express our emotions. So this clinical example that I want to make is an incident that played out in a men's group many, many years ago. This is written up in my book, so I can speak about it quite publicly because I got written permission. There was ethics clearance and all of those things. So this guy, he agreed to participate in this, for me to use this incident. So he was a 40-year-old male at the time. He was married, childless, but his wife was beginning to pile on the pressure for them to start a family, to start having children. And he had very strong resistance. He didn't want to have children. And this was actually the issue that brought him to see me. So 3 sessions into our one-on-one, which is about usually how I do it, I got him to follow me. He was also resistant to come to the men's group, right? But he agreed on the basis of the connection, the therapeutic alliance that we've established. Okay, I'm going to follow her into the men's group. 3 sessions into the men's group, was it 2 sessions? He then stays absent. We inquired. His father died suddenly, right? He's had an acrimonious relationship with his father. In fact, at the time of the sudden death of his father, they were estranged from each other for years.
Wow.
Right? So he was absent. The next session, when he came back to the men's group, of course, everybody wants to know, where were you? And, and then he said to the guys, his father died. And then, of course, the guys asked more questions. And as they asked more questions, this guy suddenly began to break down emotionally in the group with these men. Okay? So as he broke down, and and began to be vulnerable, and he started to cry, probably for the first time in his life, okay? Because often, men walk around and they bottle these things up. There's no spaces for them to go. The risk for them when they begin to be vulnerable is enormous. And so here he breaks down, right? I then sort of pushed myself more into the wall and watched how the men's group members began to gather around him, just being present, not asking too many questions, just staying present, and just allowing for this moment of breakdown and vulnerability to unfold. Okay? One guy got up to go get tissues, others sat, and once he was then, a little bit more recomposed, then the conversation continued and so on and so on. But I wrote about this incident because if I boldly state like I did in this scholarly opinion that was published in the South African Journal of Psychology, on that platform, for me to state so boldly that men are emotionally competent is because of these kinds of experiences that I've had. So I didn't do anything. His peers, all his male peers, took over. They gathered around him, they listened, they stayed present, they didn't ask intrusive questions, they allowed him to have his breakdown. We don't have to interfere. When people are having a breakdown, it's a breakdown, people.
We don't have to
fix
human.
It. No, it's normal. All right? Have you never had a breakdown? We all have it. Okay? And it's very important sometimes to have that where you cry and then you start crying and you can't stop, and then you start crying for this and for that, and then memories come. And so I also have to inform people how these things happen. All right? Then it started out with one thing, but the next thing you someone are crying about this and crying about that. And that's normal. That's human. Sometimes we become overwhelmed. And then often the guy would say, and this guy in this instance, he said he felt a huge sense of release and relief, because he could then speak about his father and what happened when he was a boy, and how his father was always working and traveling, and there was no other uncles that could take his place, and he ended up more and more estranged from his father while his father was living and even in the house, right? As they became older, things even became more complicated between him and his father. All of this came out as he was speaking to his peers. So whether I am sometimes in a one-on-one with a male and we start working through some of the childhood issues, the man, and we explore and we begin to, sort of psychologically interpret what happened. And I find, and then we start making lists, what were your feelings? I find that whether I work with a guy, I work with a woman, sometimes there's no difference. They go there, they engage with the feelings. What is more important, and I think sometimes we miss this, that is why I'm saying emotions happen in a context, emotional expression. So whether that man becomes emotional, allow himself to become vulnerable, may actually say more about the therapeutic alliance than about his capacity to be emotional. Because we know, even as a women, there are certain contexts that we know we're not going to become vulnerable. It's risky, it's dangerous, okay? And so also part of being human is taking self-care and taking care of yourself and making sure that you don't put yourself in the risk way unnecessarily, right? When it's not safe for you to be vulnerable, you don't go there. It's risky, okay? You don't want to disclose certain things that are used as weapons later.
Of course.
All right? And so we mustn't say men are not emotional. We must say, do we create safe spaces where a man can go visit his feelings without a cost to his manhood.
Yeah.
But we encourage men to become vulnerable, and then we accuse them of not being man enough.
Or then end up, as you implied earlier on, it becomes used against or exploited under other circumstances, and that's why there's so much value in this article. I would like for you to, if it's possible, if we can make this available to our listeners, and exactly because when you speak about when you unpack it in this way, and you speak about male vulnerability, you constantly emphasize also centralizing personhood and not a diagnosis, and that in and of itself seems to me also to be a core part of this as women, as we don't want to be, and we want to be cautious about this using these categories to create this unity, so to speak, or to create these compartments. We always want to emphasize that it's about complementarity, it's about humanness first of all. But this idea of not centralizing or not pathologizing a person, and not defining somebody through a diagnosis. Now using the example, this clinical example of this particular male, how does somebody like that then now, because as you said, there's the therapeutic alliance, there's the group therapy, all of those support in him in his healing process, because he's not only a man who's decided to not have children at a particular time. He's not only a man who has an acrimonious relationship with his father who's now passed. He's also a male who's still journeying.
Yeah. And so can I just say, so he is a father today. So that's the positive spin to the story. And a very doting father, I may add. Yeah. So I think often, a lot of the problems that we perceive around men's emotional expression perhaps have little to do with men, and has a lot to do with the way our society is organized. One of the problems with male emotional expression is that it requires the presence of other men. Now, you have a boy child growing up in a house with only women. And nobody actually has the conversation and say, how can we create a space for this boy to spend time with a male that is safe, and you need to supervise, you need to be careful, especially in today's times. But you need to have the conversation, and the boy needs to hear you have that conversation, that you are concerned, that he needs to have like what we call non-erotic intimacy with an older male, and that is why one of the things that I'm going to be setting up soon is actually this belonging groups for boys, so that I can offer women, especially because most boys now are in single-parent homes, or they do not have access at a very formative time of the emotional growth and the development of their identity. And they find themselves without role modeling. And so also one of the places where men and women probably differs the most is in emotional expression. For women, we dive into emotions head on, and we go deep. For men, it's more like you need to put an engine in the room, and there's a bit of a ritual, and then they take a bit longer. But once they're there, they are as competent as women to process a variety and a range of feelings. You see, and so, and I also think that when it comes to gender, a lot of these conversations have become so popularized, and it's become devoid of depth and complexity. And so you have all the social media engagement, and I'm not saying all social media engagement with gender, lacks depth, but you know what I'm trying to say, that I think that in order to understand masculinity, for instance, or male emotional expression, you have to know something about culture. You have to know something about the how does culture and our society shape what kind of emotional expression is allowed. How does culture shape masculinity? But we just come with these terms like toxic masculinity, and I'm like, I don't know what that means. It's not a term that I use. I don't find it very useful. Okay? I think it's more useful to speak about what kind of society are we? Are we a society that makes men feel included? Are we a society that engages in job creation so that we don't sit with the kind of unemployment rates that we're having? Those for me can be more useful dimensions that will help us to understand male emotional expression, for instance.
Yeah, and on that note, I think that takes us to our next conversation when we need to speak about structural violence and speak about how by design very often men react and respond in a particular way. And
I know but can I just one last thing? Because I think, there's a term, it's called drapetomania. I'm trying to say to you how we need to understand historical and much deeper things when it comes to emotions. Drapetomania was kind of a mental illness that was named for African slaves that used to run away from of captivity. And so you can see that the normal urge to run for freedom, which is a normal human urge, for a slave to want to make that break for freedom is something to be applauded. It was called a mental disorder, and they even named it. And so that is what I'm trying to say, that perhaps a lot of what we're doing today is, again, pathologizing things.
Yes.
And once we understand the context, it makes perfect sense.
And not understanding, from what I'm gathering, that it's not about a default setting, a right or a wrong. It's about understanding and about creating what you call a gender-sensitive and gender-consistent approach. As always, so insightful, Dr. Shaida Jansen, a clinical psychologist, educator, and a thought leader. Until next time, inshallah, assalamu alaikum.
Wa alaikum salam.